Reid's mornings were a predictable symphony of calculated movements. The rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine, the quiet clatter of porcelain, the rustle of financial reports spread across his polished oak table. He thrived on order, on the tangible certainty of numbers aligning, projections holding true. His apartment, a minimalist sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the city's indifferent sprawl, mirrored his life: clean lines, no clutter, no surprises. He was a creature of habit, and those habits had built him a fortress against the unpredictable chaos he observed in others. Determination was the bedrock of his existence, a quiet, unyielding force that propelled him through each meticulously planned day. That morning, however, the fortress developed a crack. The insistent buzz of his desk phone, not his personal mobile, shattered the carefully curated silence. It was the solicitor's office, a name he barely recognized, from a firm he certainly didn't. Mr. Reid, the voice on the other end, crisp and formal, inquired. Regarding the estate of a distant relative. Reid frowned, his espresso cooling untouched. He had no living relatives he knew of, certainly none distant enough to warrant a solicitor's call. He was an only child, his parents long gone, their branch of the family tree pruned down to a single, solitary leaf. The solicitor, a woman with a precise, almost clinical tone, continued, "Your great-aunt, Elara Vance. She passed away quite suddenly last week. Mysteriously, one might say, given the circumstances. She named you as the sole inheritor of her property." Elara Vance. The name was a phantom limb, a faint echo from a childhood story, perhaps. A recluse, his mother had once vaguely mentioned, who lived out in the sticks. Reid had dismissed it as a forgotten branch of the family tree. Now, that branch was bearing fruit, or perhaps, a thorny burden. "Property?" Reid asked, his voice betraying a flicker of curiosity despite himself. "A cabin, Mr. Reid. Deep in the Northwood Forest. Quite isolated. And a rather significant tract of land surrounding it." The solicitor cleared her throat. "There are some unusual stipulations in the will. You must take possession in person. And there's a small, additional structure on the property, an underground bunker, that requires your immediate attention, according to the will's precise wording." An underground bunker. The phrase hung in the air, a peculiar, anachronistic detail in an already strange conversation. It sounded less like an inheritance and more like an obligation, a riddle wrapped in old parchment. The suddenness of Elara's death, the mention of mysterious circumstances, and now this isolated cabin with a hidden bunker, chipped away at Reid's carefully constructed composure. His determination, however, quickly reasserted itself. He would investigate. He would understand. He would bring order to this unexpected chaos. 2 days later, Reid exchanged the hum of city traffic for the unsettling quiet of a winding, overgrown logging road. His sleek sedan, usually a beacon of urban efficiency, looked out of place, a glossy intruder amidst the encroaching wilderness. The asphalt had given way to crumbling gravel, then to packed earth, finally devolving into little more than a pair of muddy ruts swallowed by ferns and saplings. The forest pressed in, ancient and indifferent, its canopy a dense, unbroken ceiling that filtered the afternoon sun into sickly green shafts. The air shifted, growing heavy, damp, and smelling of rich, decaying earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old iron mixed with stagnant water. The silence here was not peaceful, it was a profound absence, a vacuum that seemed to suck the sound from the world. Even the chirping of insects felt muffled, distant. Reid gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The isolation was immediate, palpable, and unsettling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of navigating the labyrinthine track, the trees parted. Slightly. A clearing, almost entirely reclaimed by aggressive undergrowth, revealed the cabin. It was less a dwelling and more a hulking, skeletal presence. The roof sagged precariously, shingled with moss-covered cedar. A rusted, skeletal porch sagged at the front, its steps half-rotted. Reid killed the engine. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, a sound that felt deafening in the profound stillness. He walked towards the cabin, his steps deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated structure. The porch groaned under his weight as he ascended. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a drawn-out, mournful shriek that echoed deep within the cabin's interior. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of decades, the musty scent of damp wood, and something indefinable, something that prickled at the back of his throat. The light that managed to penetrate the grimy windows was weak, painting the single large room in shades of perpetual twilight. Cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries. The floorboards, warped and uneven, creaked under his weight. Reid's gaze swept across the room, noting the sparse, heavy furniture shrouded in white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. The silence was oppressive, a physical weight on his chest. He felt an intense, unnerving sensation of being observed, not by a living presence, but by the very fabric of the cabin itself. The hairs on his arms stood on end. This wasn't just an old building, it was a place that remembered. He moved deeper into the room, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. In a far corner, partially obscured by a leaning bookshelf filled with mildewed tomes, he spotted it. A heavy, square outline on the floor, framed by thick, rusted iron. A large, circular handle, equally corroded, sat flush with the wood. It was unmistakably a hatch. The solicitor's words echoed in his mind, an underground bunker that requires your immediate attention. A wave of profound unease washed over Reid. And he, Reid, was the unwitting key. The solicitor's words, dry and unyielding, had etched themselves into Reid's mind, an underground bunker. The phrase clung to him like a burr, a persistent irritant amidst the already unsettling news of Elara's abrupt demise. He barely remembered Elara, a distant cousin twice removed, a name whispered at family gatherings he'd long since forgotten. Now, her death, shrouded in what the solicitor vaguely termed mysterious circumstances, had delivered him to this place. The cabin materialized out of the deepening gloom of the forgotten forest, a silhouette against a bruised sky. Its gabled roof sagged, the windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy, moss-laden brows. The track leading to it was barely more than an animal trail, overgrown with ferns and thorny brambles that clawed at the sides of his vehicle. The air here was different, heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through ancient pines, a sound that seemed to carry an untold story. Reid pushed open the cabin door. It groaned, a mournful protest, revealing an interior steeped in shadows and the pervasive scent of dust, old wood, and something subtly acrid, like burned sugar. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating cobweb-draped furniture and stacks of yellowed books. He was determined to approach this logically, to dismiss the prickle of unease as merely the natural reaction to an old, isolated dwelling. His first task was to bring in his bags, followed by a quick survey of the main living space. As he set his worn leather satchel on a rickety side table, a faint thump echoed from somewhere upstairs. He froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind. Old house settling, he told himself, his voice a low murmur in the vast quiet. He unpacked a few essentials, placing his reading glasses on the mantelpiece beside a tarnished brass clock. When he returned from the kitchen with a bottle of water, the glasses were gone. Reid frowned, his brow furrowed. He hadn't touched them since placing them down. He checked the floor, under the table, even behind the clock. A shiver, light as a spider's touch, traced its way down his spine. He found them eventually, tucked neatly into a small, empty ceramic pot on a shelf he hadn't even noticed before. He stared at them for a long moment, the simple act of a misplaced object suddenly imbued with an unsettling weight. He shook his head, blaming fatigue, the long drive, the strangeness of it all. As dusk deepened into night, the cabin's sounds intensified. The creaks and groans became more distinct, less like the settling of wood and more like deliberate movements. A rhythmic tap-tap-tap started from the wall beside the fireplace, like a branch brushing against the exterior. He went outside to check, flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness, but there was no branch, nothing to explain the persistent rhythm. When he returned inside, the tapping had ceased. He tried to distract himself, pulling out a book, but his eyes kept darting to the corners of the room. A fleeting glimpse of a form, a distortion in the air, melting back into the permanent gloom. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. A low, guttural growl seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't loud, more a resonance than a distinct sound, like a large animal stirring deep underground. Reid's heart gave a sudden, hard lurch against his ribs. He stood, listening intently. The forest felt like a living, breathing thing, watching him. Driven by a restless energy he couldn't quite name, Reid began to explore the cabin more thoroughly, flashlight beams sweeping across dusty surfaces. He found a small, locked wooden chest tucked away in a forgotten alcove beneath the stairs. The lock was old, rusted, but yielded with a surprisingly soft click to a skeleton key he found hanging on a nail behind a faded landscape painting. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, dried leaves, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was unadorned, save for a symbol burned into the hide, a spiral with a jagged line dissecting it. The pages within were brittle, filled with elegant, looping script in faded ink. It wasn't a diary, it appeared to be a chronicle, detailing strange observations, peculiar rituals, and mentions of a deep pact and the guardian of the threshold. The language was archaic, veiled, hinting at something ancient and profoundly unsettling. Reid's fingers trembled slightly as he held the journal. This wasn't just an old house settling. This wasn't just fatigue or imagination. Wall, its hearth cold and empty. There were no visible windows from the inside, only thick, unyielding walls of stone. It was as if the place was meant to keep something in, not merely keep the elements out. Reid felt a profound sense of unease, a prickling sensation on his skin, as if unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Only the drip, drip, drip answered him, a little louder now, somewhere behind the far wall. He spent the first few days in a haze of unpacking and disquiet. The cabin, as he stubbornly called it, felt less like an inheritance and more like a burden. He tried to clean, but the dust seemed to regenerate, clinging to everything like a fine shroud. The strange occurrences began subtly. A floorboard would creak upstairs, but there was no upstairs. A faint scratching sound, like claws on stone, would emanate from the walls, only to cease the moment he stopped to listen. He'd leave a book on the table, only to find it on the cot an hour later. A cup he'd used would be moved to a different shelf. He rationalized it, of course. Old house settling, he'd mutter to himself, just my imagination playing tricks. But the seed of doubt had been planted, slowly germinating in the fertile ground of his isolation. One evening, while trying to light the old oil lamp, there was no electricity, as the lawyer had doubted the relentless, stifling silence of the cabin. Reid stood perfectly still, breath held captive in his chest, straining his ears against the sudden void. The low, guttural vibration had vanished as abruptly as it arrived, leaving behind only the frantic drumming of his own pulse against his eardrums. He waited, muscles tensed, for a repeat, for any echo of that subterranean stirring, but the cabin remained unervingly quiet, the ancient timbers groaning only with the shifting weight of the wind outside. His gaze swept the floorboards where he'd felt the resonance most acutely. There was nothing visibly amiss, no loose boards, no obvious trapdoors. Yet, the feeling of something beneath persisted, a phantom tremor in his bones. Reid was done with guessing. The cabin was a cage, and whatever was rattling its bars was demanding attention. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. He dropped to his knees, running his hands over the floorboards, feeling for any subtle unevenness, any seam that didn't quite fit. He moved slowly, methodically, from the center of the room outwards, his flashlight beam sweeping ahead of him. Minutes crawled by, each one stretching taut with anticipation. Then, near the hearth, where the stone met the wood, his fingers snagged on something. Not a splinter, but a faint, almost imperceptible ridge. He pressed harder, tracing the outline. It was a hairline crack, impossibly thin, running along the grain of two adjacent planks. Reid pulled at one, then the other, but they held fast. He pushed. Nothing. He tried again, pushing down with his palm on one plank, then sliding his fingers under the edge of the other, searching for a latch, a release. His efforts were rewarded with a soft click, barely audible above his ragged breathing. The plank nearest the hearth shifted, sinking slightly. He gripped it, pulling upwards with all his strength. With a groan of rusted hinges and the splintering protest of old wood, a section of the floorboards, roughly 3 feet square, lifted inwards and downwards, revealing a rectangular opening. It was a raw, primeval scent that prickled the hairs on his arms. A narrow, rough-hewn stone staircase descended into absolute black. The steps were uneven, slick with moisture. This wasn't a cellar, it felt older, more deliberate. An underground bunker. The words formed in his mind, heavy with implication. This was no simple storage space. Taking a deep, bracing breath, Reid descended. The air grew heavier with each step, the earthy smell intensifying. Cobwebs, thick and ancient, draped like gray shrouds from the low ceiling. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a small, circular chamber. The underground bunker was cramped, claustrophobic. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's cone, thick as fog. In the center of the room, on a rudimentary wooden table, sat a single, heavy object. Reid moved towards it, his boots crunching on loose gravel. Beside it lay a quill pen, its feather long since crumbled to dust, and a small, stoppered inkwell, dry as bone. This wasn't just old, it was ancient. He picked up the journal. He opened it carefully, the brittle pages threatening to tear. The script was faded, elegant but spidery, written in a hand that spoke of desperate haste and profound fear. He brought the flashlight closer, squinting at the archaic language. It took him a moment to decipher the looping script, but the words, once understood, hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a confession, a chronicle written by a distant ancestor, a man named Elias. The entries detailed a terrible pact, made generations ago, to appease a malevolent entity tied to the very land the cabin stood upon. Elias wrote of drought, blight, and unspeakable illnesses that had plagued the family and the surrounding forest, until a desperate bargain was struck. The entity demanded sustenance, a periodic offering, a sacrifice of blood and spirit, to ensure the prosperity of the lineage. The land demands its due, Elias had written in a trembling hand, a life for a season, a soul for the soil. Our bloodline is bound, a chain forged in fear and desperation. The creature sleeps, but it hungers. It is not of the woods, but is the woods. The entity was not merely haunting the cabin, it was an intrinsic part of the earth beneath, a primordial horror awakened and then placated through generations of silent, gruesome tribute. They were the entity's periodic feast. He was not just an inheritor of a cabin, he was an inheritor of a debt, a blood pact. And the last payment was long overdue. As he absorbed the horrifying truth, a low, rhythmic thrumming began, deep within the stone walls of the underground bunker. It was a sound that vibrated through his very teeth, a sound like a vast, ancient heart slowly, deliberately, beginning to beat again. The beam of his flashlight flickered, then dimmed, threatening to die. He wasn't alone in the bunker. Whatever Elias had appeased, whatever had stirred beneath the floorboards, it was awake. And it knew he was there. Reid's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the frigid truth seeping into his bones. The journal lay open on the rough-hewn table, the ancestor's elegant script now a series of grim condemnations. Gruesome tribute. Silent pact. The words echoed, each one a hammer blow against the thin veneer of his sanity. The sudden, mysterious deaths were not sudden at all, they were part of a meticulous, horrifying schedule. He felt a profound sickness churn in his gut, a sickening recognition that the world he'd known, the history he'd learned, was a fragile lie built over an abyss of ancient, unspeakable horror. The air felt heavier, denser, as if the very walls were pressing in, absorbing the light. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the cabin, a hungry, waiting maw built over something far older, far more malevolent. He needed to understand the mechanics, the cycle his ancestor had so painstakingly detailed. The journal mentioned a sanctuary below the earth, a place where the offerings are prepared and presented. He knew exactly what that meant. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of leaves outside the window, seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. He found the access point in the furthest corner of the root cellar, hidden behind a stack of rotted firewood. The air that seeped from beneath it carried a smell, a blend of damp earth, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, dried blood. He wrestled with the hatch, its hinges groaning in protest, showering him with rust and dust. The lantern beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow, stone-lined passage. This was it. The underground bunker. He took a deep breath, tasting the stale, heavy air, and started down, each step echoing with an unnatural clarity. The passage opened into a larger chamber, low-ceilinged and claustrophobic. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture. Condensation beaded on his forehead, mingling with sweat. Not distinct words, but a low, sibilant murmur, like dry leaves skittering across concrete, or insects swarming. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a constant, insidious presence brushing against the edges of his hearing. He spun around, the lantern beam sweeping wildly, but saw nothing. Yet, the sound intensified, coalescing into something vaguely human, a choked gasp, a desperate plea. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to resonate inside his skull. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the depths of the bunker, directly ahead. Reid's breath hitched. It sounded like bone snapping. He forced himself forward, his boots crunching on something dry and powdery. He didn't want to look down, but his gaze was drawn, against his will, to a scattering of small, brittle fragments on the floor. Too small to identify, too numerous to ignore. A tremor ran through the stone floor beneath his feet, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated up his legs. The walls seemed to draw closer, the ceiling to press down. He felt a crushing weight on his chest, a desperate need for air that wasn't being met. He raised the lantern, his hand shaking so violently the light danced erratically. Before him, carved into the rough stone wall, was a shallow alcove. And within it, the reveal, a collection of crude, skeletal effigies. Not animal bones, he realized with a sickening lurch, but unmistakably human. Small, childlike bones, meticulously arranged, bound with sinew and dried plant fibers, forming grotesque, distorted figures. Each one faced a central, larger carving, a bas-relief in the stone that depicted a writhing, amorphous shape, tentacles and gaping maws suggested in its unnatural contours. Below it, scratched into the stone, was a symbol he recognized from the journal, the sign for tribute received. A profound, guttural moan filled the bunker, not from Reid, but from the air itself. He stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, falling heavily. The screen glowed, but it wasn't a call or a message. Below it, a single word, burned onto the display as if etched by acid, mine. The image flickered, replaced by static, then by a blackness deeper than the bunker's gloom. The phone died in his hand. Reid stared at the dead screen, then at the skeletal effigies, then at the ancient symbol. It wasn't just haunting the cabin, it was claiming him. He wasn't just an heir to a property, he was the next in line for the tribute. The underground bunker wasn't just a place of ritual, it was a living trap, and he was already caught within its suffocating grasp. The blackness of the dead phone screen mirrored the deeper gloom that had settled over Reid. His breath hitched, a raw, ragged sound in the suffocating silence of the underground bunker. The skeletal effigies, still and silent, seemed to watch him from their perch, their empty eye sockets fixed on his unraveling form. The ancient symbol, etched into the rough stone behind them, throbbed with an unseen energy, a malevolent pulse that resonated deep within his bones. Terror, a physical entity, had wrapped its icy tendrils around him, squeezing his chest until he thought his lungs might collapse. He staggered backward, away from the shrine, his heel scraping on the gritty concrete floor. The air, already thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, suddenly felt impossibly heavy, pressing in on him. He clutched the inert phone, a useless brick in his trembling hand, then threw it against the wall with a choked cry of frustration. There was no signal down here, no connection to the outside world, no lifeline. He was utterly, completely alone. Panic clawed at his throat. He had to get out. Not just out of the bunker, but out of the cabin, out of this cursed forest. He ascended clumsily, his muscles screaming in protest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Each rung was a struggle, his fear lending a leaden weight to his limbs. He reached the hatch, a heavy plate of rusted metal set into the ceiling. He pushed, grunting with effort, but it didn't budge. He pushed again, harder, his shoulders straining, the rusty metal groaning in protest. It felt like it was sealed shut, bolted from the outside, or perhaps simply fused by decades of neglect. As he braced himself for another desperate shove, his gaze fell on the concrete wall beside the ladder's base. It wasn't uniform. Faint, shallow carvings, almost imperceptible beneath layers of grime and moisture, snaked across the surface. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light filtering from the single bare bulb above. They weren't mere scratches, they were symbols, crude but deliberate. He traced one with a trembling finger, a twisted representation of a tree, its roots delving deep into the earth, its branches reaching skyward, but unlike any tree he'd seen, its trunk was split, revealing a cavity. And within that cavity, a tiny, almost invisible figure, kneeling. A sacrifice. Then, beside it, a series of dates, crudely etched. Spanning generations. The most recent one was shockingly close to his own time, barely a decade past. This wasn't just a storage space, it was a record, a grim ledger hidden away, detailing the lineage of sacrifice, a testament to the pact. The entity wasn't just old, it had been actively fed, generation after generation. A wave of nausea washed over him. He recoiled from the wall, the implications chilling him far more than the cold air. The hatch, with a final, agonizing shriek of tortured metal, suddenly gave way under his desperate assault. He scrambled through, gasping, collapsing onto the leaf-strewn forest floor, pulling the hatch shut with a desperate clang. He pushed himself to his feet, eyes wide, scanning the ancient trees. The air here was different, still, yet alive with an unseen presence. He started to run, blindly, desperately, crashing through the undergrowth, his boots squelching on the damp earth. The forest seemed to swallow him whole. The path, if there ever was one, dissolved into a tangle of roots and thorny bushes. The trees, ancient sentinels with gnarled limbs, wove a dense canopy overhead, blotting out the sky. Sunlight became a distant memory, replaced by a perpetual twilight. He pushed forward, his lungs burning, his mind a frantic kaleidoscope of fear and desperation. He kept seeing the same twisted oak, the same cluster of moss-covered boulders. The forest wasn't letting him leave. Only the impassive, looming trunks, the rustle of leaves that sounded less like nature and more like a furtive movement. He stumbled over an unseen root, falling hard to his knees, his hands tearing on sharp stones. He pulled out his phone again, a futile gesture, but instinctual. Still dead. He stuffed it back into his pocket, his mind fraying at the edges. Was he even running in the right direction? The compass in his mind spun wildly, directionless. He could almost make out words, fragments of phrases that spoke of home and debt and inheritance. They were inside his head, or were they? He pressed on, his legs aching, his mind a whirlwind of torment. He could feel eyes on him, countless unseen eyes tracking his every move. The branches above seemed to reach for him, skeletal fingers grasping, and the ground itself felt like it was actively trying to trip him, tangling his feet in unseen vines. He was lost, utterly, hopelessly lost in a forest that was alive and hostile. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. The cabin. He had been running for what felt like hours, a frantic, desperate escape, and yet here it was, mocking him, pulling his back. His legs gave out. He collapsed, sobbing, onto the damp earth. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the forest, the very ground beneath his feet. He was trapped. Despair, cold and sharp, threatened to swallow him whole. Yet, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered in his chest. He couldn't give up, not now. He wouldn't. He fumbled in the tattered satchel he'd brought, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of a small, hand-crank lantern. A gift from his grandfather, long forgotten, now a potential lifeline. The beam danced across the roughly hewn stone walls, the packed dirt floor, and the unsettling array of effigies. They were made of branches and twine, adorned with dried herbs and scraps of cloth, each roughly humanoid. He'd dismissed them as macabre decorations before, but now, under the lantern's unsteady glow, they felt like sentinels, silent witnesses to generations of unspeakable acts. Their stillness was more unsettling than any movement could have been. He examined the central, altar-like stone block that the effigies ringed. Its surface was smooth, worn, with faint, almost invisible etchings. He ran his fingers over them, tracing lines that felt too deliberate to be natural cracks. They weren't symbols he recognized, but they vibrated with an ancient, unsettling energy beneath his touch. Nothing. The walls, however, were different. One section, behind the largest effigy, seemed slightly off. He pushed, heaved, scraped his knuckles raw, but the stone remained stubbornly in place. A sigh of frustration escaped him, laced with a growing panic. Time was running out. He could feel it in the air, a prickling sensation on his skin, a pressure building behind his eyes. He stepped back, letting the lantern light wash over the effigy again. It was taller than the others, its branch limbs reaching upwards, as if in supplication or despair. Its head was a gnarled knot of wood, its empty eye sockets seeming to bore into him. And then he saw it. Tucked into the rough twine binding of its chest, a small, rolled-up cylinder, barely visible in the dim light. With trembling fingers, Reid pulled it free. It was a scroll, made of some brittle, parchment-like material, tied with a length of faded crimson thread. As he untied it, a cloud of dust puffed into the air, carrying that metallic, sweet scent more strongly. He unrolled it carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. The parchment was covered in the same strange symbols etched on the altar, but also in faded, spidery script, recognizable as an archaic form of English. He held the lantern closer, its light barely sufficient to make out the words. The script was difficult to decipher, faded and archaic, but the meaning, as it slowly coalesced, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Dot upon this sacred earth, where the ancestors rest, a binding pact was forged. For protection, for prosperity, for the lineage to flourish without end, a portion of the life force, a tribute, must be given. The guardian of the threshold, ancient and ever-present, demands its sustenance. Every generation, a life. A vessel for the release, a conduit for the passage. Every generation, a life. This wasn't just a ghost story, it was a horrifying, generational curse. The sudden, mysterious deaths in his family, the accidents and illnesses that always seemed to claim a relative just as they came into their prime. It wasn't random. It was a ritual. He continued to read, his eyes darting across the brittle page, absorbing the horrific details. The guardian was not a spirit, not a demon in the traditional sense, but an elemental force, a primordial consciousness born of the land itself, bound by the pact. It fed on the essence of life, specifically the potential of life, the vitality of a soul vibrant and unburdened by age. The cabin, the forest, even the lineage itself, were merely extensions of its ancient, demanding will. It offered protection, yes, but at an unspeakable cost. The sacrifice must be willing, or made so by the binding. It must be of the blood, and when the time comes, the vessel will be drawn to the heart of the pact, to the earth where the guardian sleeps and wakes. The current bearer of the bloodline, the one who unearths this truth, is marked. Their potential shines brightest, their connection to the threshold is strongest. They are the chosen vessel, the offering long awaited. The words blurred, but their meaning burned itself into Reid's mind. He was the marked one. He was the chosen vessel. His discovery wasn't a triumph, it was a death sentence. The realization hit him with sickening clarity. His arrival at the cabin, his relentless pursuit of the truth, it had all been orchestrated, a macabre path laid out for him by a force older than memory. The entity hadn't been trying to scare him away, it had been luring him in, preparing him, fattening him for the slaughter. A low hum vibrated through the stone floor, a sound that seemed to originate deep within the earth itself. The lantern light flickered wildly, threatening to die. The effigies, previously still, now seemed to lean in, their skeletal forms swaying almost imperceptibly in the unnatural draft that had sprung from nowhere. They pressed in, not solid, but palpable, like a physical weight. The guardian was here, awake, and it had claimed him. He wasn't just understanding its nature, he was experiencing it. He was feeling its hunger. His hand clenched the scroll, the brittle parchment, threatening to crumble. The sacrifice wasn't just a life, it was his life. And the entity wasn't just a malevolent spirit, it was a primordial hunger, ancient and insatiable, now fully aware of the feast before it. Reid was no longer merely an heir, he was the offering. The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The words still clawed at the back of Reid's throat, a burning brand. Marked. Chosen vessel. It wasn't a family curse, it was a trap, generations in the making, and he, in his naive pursuit of truth, had walked right into its gaping maw. He was not merely an inheritor, he was the final piece, the key to its full awakening. The realization was a bitter draught, curdling in his gut. But with the sickening clarity came a flicker of defiance. He wouldn't be a lamb to the slaughter. Not if he could help it. He stood in the center of the cabin, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight as if the very structure was impatient for his surrender. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak morning light that pierced the grimy windows, but the cabin's true nature, its oppressive shadow, remained undiminished. He clutched the tattered journal, its brittle pages now unopened in his hands, revealing not just his fate but, perhaps, a way out. He'd spent the night poring over the cryptic entries, deciphering the ancestors' frantic, half-mad scrawls. There was a place, mentioned only in hushed tones in crude sketches, an auxiliary chamber, a root cellar of secrets. An underground bunker. It was where the original pact had been witnessed, where its power was anchored. And, perhaps, where it could be unmade. Reid gathered what he could, a handful of dried herbs from the cabin's forgotten pantry, a small, rusted iron blade, and the crucial pages from the journal, now folded and tucked into his pocket like a prayer. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence that seemed to press down on his skull. Whispers slithered from the corners of the room, formless and indistinct, yet their intent was clear: stay. The entrance to the underground bunker was hidden beneath a loose flagstone in the cabin's dilapidated root cellar, a space Reid had previously dismissed as just another decaying part of the structure. A set of rough-hewn wooden steps descended into absolute blackness. He lit a lantern, its feeble glow carving a meager circle out of the gloom, and began his descent. Each step creaked, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. At the bottom, a small, circular chamber opened up, barely large enough for him to stand upright. The walls of the underground bunker were not bare. They pulsed faintly in the lantern light, an internal glow that made Reid's stomach clench. In the center of the floor, a single, flat stone slab lay, scarred and blackened. This was it. The altar. The heart of the horror. He spread the journal pages on the cold stone, his hands trembling, but his resolve held firm. The words, once baffling, now resonated with a terrible clarity. It was a counter-ritual, a severance. Not a breaking of the pact, but a redirection, a final, desperate offering. The entity's presence in the bunker intensified, a palpable weight pressing down on him, trying to crush his will. Reid began to chant, his voice raspy, the ancient words feeling alien on his tongue. He sprinkled the dried herbs, a faint, acrid smoke rising into the stagnant air. The iron blade felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he traced the symbols on the stone slab, following the instructions meticulously. Then, the true horror of the pact revealed itself. The pact wasn't merely for a life, or even a bloodline. It was for a vessel, yes, but not just any vessel. It was a pact for a conscious, willing sacrifice, a soul offered freely, knowingly, to anchor the entity to this plane, to feed its insatiable hunger for generations. His ancestors hadn't just made a deal, they had condemned their descendants to a terrifying, eternal purpose. And now, he was the chosen one to fulfill that purpose, to become the final, perfect sacrifice. His arrival, his quest, his discovery, it had all been orchestrated, a slow, agonizing preparation for this moment. The entity shrieked then, a sound that wasn't sound, but a tearing of the very fabric of reality within the bunker, a rending that threatened to shatter Reid's eardrums and his sanity. He stumbled, the iron blade clattering against the stone, but he caught himself, his eyes fixed on the burning page. The counter-ritual wasn't to break the pact, but to transfer it, to force the entity into a new anchor, a new vessel, but who or what? He looked at the final line of the text, the last desperate scrawl of his ancestor, and a sickening realization dawned. The ancestor hadn't broken the pact. He had merely delayed it, passed the burden. And the counter-ritual wasn't about breaking the chain, but about forging a new link, a different kind of sacrifice. It demanded not a life, but a choice. Reid stood in the suffocating heart of the underground bunker, the entity's power swirling around him, roaring its fury. The choice was stark, terrifying, and utterly his. He had to offer not his life, but his will. He gripped the iron blade, its cold metal a grounding force, and stared into the swirling abyss of the entity's presence, knowing that whatever he chose, it would be the ultimate sacrifice. He lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor, every fiber of his being screaming with exhaustion, a profound emptiness gnawing at his core. The echoing silence that now clung to the walls was not a relief, but a deeper, more insidious dread. It was the sound of a predator, fed and sated, but still present, its presence now an absence that vibrated in his bones. His head throbbed, a dull, relentless drumbeat behind his eyes, and when his fingers brushed his temple, they came away sticky. He didn't bother to look. The physical pain was a distant hum compared to the gaping chasm inside him. Marked. He dragged himself to the dusty, mildewed table, bracing his weight against it. But it wasn't just the exhaustion that distorted his features. There was a knowledge there, a quiet, terrible understanding that hadn't existed before. It was the face of someone who had seen beyond the veil, and had not come back entirely whole. The entity was gone. Or so he told himself. A connection. He had thought he was fighting to break a pact, to sever a lineage of suffering. Instead, he had merely fulfilled it. He was the end of the line, the final sacrifice, not of his life, but of his innocence, his peace, his very self. He remembered the culmination, the terrifying clarity as the pieces clicked into place. He had sought truth, and in finding it, had become the conduit. The horror hadn't been defeated, it had simply passed through him, leaving its indelible stain. His gaze drifted to the rough-hewn wooden shelves, lined with arcane relics and yellowed documents that had once held such terrifying allure. Now, they seemed inert, drained of their malevolent energy. Or perhaps, he thought with a shudder, he was the relic now. He was the repository. The cabin above, which had once felt like a living, breathing maw, now felt quiet. Eerily so. The cost was not a limb or an organ, but the inviolability of his own mind. He felt porous, permeable. The world had shifted on its axis, and he was left adrift, forever seeing the faint outlines of the monstrous beneath the mundane. He tried to recall simple things, the smell of pine needles without the accompanying stench of decay, the sound of wind without the undertone of a sighing lament. It was like trying to grasp smoke. Every sensation was now filtered through the lens of what he had endured, tainted by the knowledge of what lay just beyond perception. His hand went instinctively to his chest, over his heart. He had survived. He was alive. But the Reid who had arrived at the cabin, naive and curious, was gone. He pushed himself away from the table, his legs stiff. The bunker, once a sanctuary of hidden knowledge, now felt like a prison, or perhaps a birthing chamber for whatever new, monstrous iteration of himself had emerged. He looked towards the rough wooden ladder leading up, back into the world, back into the cabin. He was free, perhaps, but at what price? And to what end? The answer, he suspected, would haunt him long after the dust of the bunker had settled. The cold concrete floor of the underground bunker pressed against Reid's cheek, gritty and unyielding. Every muscle in his body screamed, a chorus of protest against the ordeal that had just transpired. That profound emptiness, a gnawing cavity in his core, wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the echo of something torn away, a void where a malignant presence had once coiled, its tendrils woven into the very fabric of his being. He had faced it, whatever it asterisk was, an ancient hunger, a generational parasite, and in the dim, stale air of this subterranean tomb, he had severed its connection. Or, at least, he believed he had. Slowly, painstakingly, Reid pushed himself up, his limbs heavy as lead. His head throbbed, a dull drumbeat behind his eyes. He fumbled, his fingers brushing against cold stone, then the slick, decaying leather of a large book. The ledger. The source of his terrible understanding. He remembered the pages, brittle as dead leaves, detailing the long parade of names, the dates, the cryptic symbols. It wasn't a pact in the conventional sense, not a deal struck with a conscious entity, but an obligation, a perpetuation. The cabin, the land, it demanded sustenance, and the bloodline of his distant relative had been bound to provide it. Sacrifice, not merely of life, but of will, of essence. He had found the true heart of the malevolence within the bunker, not a creature of flesh and blood, but a conduit, a focal point for the malevolent energy that had collected over centuries. He had, in his final, desperate act, shattered it. He didn't know how, only that a terrible, soul-wrenching shriek had ripped through the air, vibrating not from his ears but from deep within his bones, and then Reid crawled towards the access shaft, his hands scraped raw against the rough-hewn walls. He emerged into the dying light of dawn, blinking against the muted gray sky filtering through the dense canopy. The forest felt different. Not peaceful, not cleansed, but quiet. A new kind of quiet. The birds, still hesitant, offered only sporadic, tentative chirps. He stumbled towards the cabin, his legs threatening to buckle. It was just a cabin, old and decaying, its secrets finally laid bare. He pushed open the creaking front door. The interior was still, dusty. The cabin was empty. Truly empty. A wave of nausea washed over him. The victory, if it could be called that, tasted like ash. He had stopped the cycle, broken the lineage of sacrifice, but at what cost? He looked at his hands, seeing not merely the dirt and dried blood, but the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that now accompanied their stillness. He had purged the horror from the cabin, but the horror had, in turn, purged something from him. He was a vessel scoured clean, but the scouring had left scars, indelible marks on his psyche. He saw the world differently now. The ancient, unseen currents of malevolence that flowed beneath the surface of reality were no longer a distant rumor, they were a tangible, terrifying truth. Reid didn't pack. There was nothing to take. He simply walked out, leaving the cabin door ajar, a silent invitation for the elements to reclaim it. He didn't look back. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, no longer held a direct, personal threat, but rather a universal one. He reached his vehicle, its dust-covered exterior a stark contrast to the verdant, untouched forest. Starting the engine, the rumble felt alien, too loud in the quiet morning. As he drove away, the cabin disappearing from view, then the forest itself receding into the rearview mirror, Reid felt no relief, no lightness. Only a profound, heavy understanding. He had survived. He had won. But the victory hadn't freed him. It had merely initiated him into a truth too terrible to ignore.